fudge a little bit
Right.
and go back. All right, so we are gonna start on page 741 with verse 23.
741, verse 23. 741, verse 23.
Okay, but before we start, I need to perhaps do a few words of introduction, especially since we are not doing the early part of the Torah portion, since we're in the second third of the triennial cycle. And so chapter 25 defines the legal status of land in Israel and how it is held by clans and individuals within ancient Israelite society. It will set forth a procedure for the sale or transfer of land and provide certain guarantees for the owners of that land. And we're going to be introduced to a system of indenture whereby debtors repay their indebtedness through their own labor. So the basic theory of land tenure, and part of why I wanted to start with verses 23 and 24, which we'll read now. But the land must not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. You are but strangers resident with me. Throughout the land that you hold, you must provide for the redemption of the land. So what's the Torah telling us here? Essentially that God, to whom all land ultimately belongs, has granted the land of Israel to the people of Israel as an everlasting achuzah. All right, I use the Hebrew word because we're going to need to define it. All right, achuzah comes from the word hold, from the root meaning to hold. So it's a holding, right? And part of the conditions of tenure include a denial of the right to alienate the land. You can't just say, not mine. Don't want it, don't need it. Feel free, you can have it. Does not work that way. Right? In the book of Deuteronomy, we see there's a prohibition on encroaching on another person's property by altering established boundaries. And that's similar to what we see in ancient Near Eastern treaties regarding the movement of boundary stones. Right? So if there's a marker that says, this is the border, this is the dividing line between your property and my property, it is a really big no-no to move it. Right? The book of Numbers sets forth rules of inheritance of family property. And we see in the books of the prophets, Isaiah and Micah, routinely condemning the rich and their propensity to foreclose on the land of the poor. Right? They're very bothered by the inequities and disparities that are created by the rich exercising their ability to foreclose on loans and on land that leave people off the land. And in the book of Kings, we're told the story of how even the king, now this is in a confrontation between Eliyahu and Achav, right? Where Achav wants a piece of land owned by this guy, and he's not, even though he's the king, allowed to compel that person to sell any part of his family estate, right? If it's your land, you get to keep it, and not even the king can compel you otherwise. There are a variety of biblical institutions that relate to the role of arable land in an agricultural economy. Remember, our Israelite ancestors were primarily farmers or in some way tied to the land. If they weren't farmers, they were herders. But in order to have herds, you needed places for them to graze. So they grazed on your land. Theoretically, you could decide, I don't like being a herder of cattle. I would rather be a raiser of crops. And you can simply say, okay, sell off the cattle, and next year we're going into farming. Yes.
Wasn't the land mostly desert and arid?
No.
Sorry.
You okay?
Yeah, I'll go there.
No, actually, part of the thing that we have to remember is the land of Israel became very lacking in viability. And, you know, we all know the stories of, you know, what the Jews found when they made Aliyah in the 18th century, and it was not a great place, right? But it became not a great place over time, in part by constant warfare, and in part by neglect. The land described in the Torah has areas of wilderness, right? But let's not think wilderness as desert. It was a land that was fertile. So you know, your geography would determine what grew, what you might grow. So for example, if you were in the more mountainous terrains, you were more likely to have apple orchards or vineyards or things of that nature that could accommodate to that kind of landscape and topology. If you were in the plains, you would be more likely to be growing seed crops and other vegetable type things.
Seems like the constancy of water or the dependability of having water and seasonal water would be very important.
Yes.
We say Marit Hatal.
Yeah, look, water wasn't essential for growing anything anywhere. And yes, for the Israelites, you know, a good winter meant that there was adequate water in rivers, in streams, and in the ground and in the soil itself. When that didn't happen, that's when you had problems of crop failure and famine, which the Torah is not bashful about talking. So the agricultural balance was somewhat, I wouldn't say perilous, but the balance was easily thrown off, which is part of how we'll see people came to be indentured. And this is the phenomenon that we're going to see in many ways persists in agricultural communities into the present, right? Or very close to the present, right? You are a farmer. Better you than me, because if I had to survive on my agricultural skills, not so much, right? What does a farmer need at the beginning of the season?
Seeds?
All right, you need
Rain.
seed, you need,
Fertile soil.
okay, what else?
Water?
Yes,
Sun.
you're thinking too.
Something to plow the field?
Thank you. You need
Labor.
labor, or you need to rent critters, or labor to help plow the fields and plant stuff. Once things are planted, you might not need some of that labor until
Harvest.
harvest time. Right? Maintaining the field, depending on how much irrigation you need to do, is not as much as plowing and harvesting. Right? So you have upfront expenses. I need to rent, a bunch of oxen and a yoke to put on them and a plow. Right? If you want to call that, a tractor and all that other modern equipment, right? Those are expensive. And the truth of the matter is, I don't need it all year round. I only need it now.
But everybody needs it at the same time in a given area.
Yes, but if you get it for 3 days and I get it 3 days after that, and yes, yes, we're all in the same general time frame, but the cost of maintaining an ox for an entire year relative to being a little flexible in when I do my plowing is kind of an easy choice. The other possibility is, you go to the guy who's the cattle herder and you buy, fresh oxen, use them for plowing and other purposes, and then their dinner. Not very practical, but it was a reality, right? This is true into modernity, where farmers need to hire laborers. You talk about migrant laborers all the time. So I have upfront expenses, right? When am I going to be able to pay those debts? After the harvest. So if I'm plowing and planting in March and April, yes, I may start harvesting depending on what I'm growing in August and September and October. And at the end of the growing season, when I've harvested everything and I bring it to market, I take my income and I pay the person who I bought seed from, and I pay off the person I borrowed money from to pay my laborers, et cetera, et cetera. I pay my debts, and hopefully there's enough there, both in terms of produce and funds for me to make it to the next spring. Most farmers lived on a very narrow margin. Okay.
Today, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say another modern day device is cooperation, co-ops amongst farmers. My own relatives on my mother's side were farmers in North Carolina. And we sometime, and that's everybody's crop didn't come in on the same day. It was, it was a stretch of time, and they would help each other. They would, okay, the Smith family is going to come over and supply 2 or 3 people to. It's not, even some of the equipment was kind of shared.
Absolutely.
Around there, so.
Absolutely. And that was sort of the norm in a great many community farming and agricultural communities. You also had okay, let's leave that. You had a comment.
I was just gonna say, it's called today living paycheck to paycheck.
Or crop to crop. Yes, absolutely. All right. So part of what's introduced here is the concept of a sabbatical year. We were introduced to it already in the book of Exodus, wherein Israelite fields are to lie fallow every 7th year. The sowing of fields, the tending of vineyards is prohibited, and the needy have free access to the fields. So do you, but not more so just because it's your field. Whatever grows, Sam can take it, you can take it, you can take it, anybody can come and take it with equalness.
But you're not supposed to actually plant and plow. that
Right, you're not
field.
supposed to actively grow stuff, but stuff will grow kind of naturally, because just the nature of things fall on the ground, they sink in. Are you gonna get as much? Of course not. The presumption is that you, the landowner, or at least the way it's put forth in the Torah, is that you, the landowner, will have reaped enough in year 6 to provide for year 7. Well, no, it does not always happen, though in the biblical model, yes, it does.
In the biblical model, the problem is, yes, one, it's difficult to do. Second of all, is it enforced?
Well,
Back then, how did they enforce it?
enforcement was predicated, the way it's set forth here is, what's the, and this is true for most of the book of Leviticus, what is the underlying reason for which a person does what they do?
For holiness.
Yeah, it's, you are doing what God asks, what God tasks, and therefore you emulate God. So is there enforcement? There's nothing that suggests it here. Right? So the term that we're gonna be introduced to, that I use the English of sabbatical here, is shmita. Now the key verb here is shamat, which means to let go or release, right? It is concerned with the indebtedness, and it created a moratorium on debt every 7th year so that people did not end up in perpetual states of indebtedness and indenture. Right? It also meant that what you could, quote, borrow was more limited by when in the cycle you wanted to get the loan, such that if it's year 1 of a 7-year cycle, I might be more inclined to put forth a larger loan to you because I've got 6 years in which to recoup the debt.
So it was a universal 7 years. It wasn't, if I get a loan this year, I owe it in.
There's some question as to whether it was a personal 7-year, but the way the Torah seems to describe it and the way the rabbis seem to understand it, it was a fixed 7-year cycle. And after 7 7-year cycles, you got to the Jubilee year, which was year 50. Right? The only way you can make that really work is if everybody's on the same system and the same cycle. Part of the practice connected with this was, right, and so I wanted to show you the indentured part, the indebtedness part, because in an agrarian society, the two were linked together. So if I am loaning you money and you default on the loan, I have the produce of the land as my return on the loan. In other words, you work the land, you become my indentured servant, you work for me, I have to maintain you because now you are mine, so I have to provide you shelter and food and stuff like that. And then I take the produce and I sell the produce. And when, let's say, it was a small debt, you paid it, I got my money, recouped my money within 2 years, then fine, it's yours. I don't even have to hold it for the whole time. But if the Shemitah comes along, then there's a change. Yes, Beverly.
Is this process still followed in some areas of Israel?
Yes. You will see routinely fields that are marked as Shemitah fields, wherein they are left fallow. Right? Part of this is based on the practice of allowing arable land to lie fallow periodically as a necessary feature of ancient agriculture, especially where extensive irrigation was being used, because it reduced the alkalines and the sodium and the calcium deposits that were created by the irrigation process itself. So just because I was bringing water, it came with things that I also didn't necessarily want. So the fallow year, by not adding to it, allows it to sort of dissipate into the ground.
But fallowness is also a part of modern agriculture.
Yes, absolutely. Our ancient ancestors knew a thing or two.
Well, did they? Or
No, they really did, because while the Torah elevates it into a very elaborate model, it's clear that other ancient societies engaged in certain similar types of practice.
Like planting clover to fix nitrogen or some other crops that fixes the nitrogen in the soil.
Or
That's
there were any number of different
like a
right.
farming techniques that they recognized were beneficial to the land. Now, what's interesting here is our chapter does not mention a release from indebtedness and indenture, but rather there's an exhortation that the clan relatives of the person who's fallen into debt is to be ransomed. This is especially true for anyone who falls into debt to an alien resident of the land. Now, someone should ask the obvious question.
What does that mean?
Who are the aliens?
Cool.
It's not China, China would be today, but who was it back then?
Okay, so part of the interesting discussion amongst modern biblical scholars is the fact that the whole idea of Shemitah and freedom from debt and land lying fallow on a 7-year cycle is mentioned in the book of Exodus. It's mentioned here in the book of Leviticus, and it's mentioned again in the book of Deuteronomy. Right? Modern biblical scholars know that the book of Deuteronomy is actually later in terms of its historical development than the sources that go into creating Exodus and Leviticus. However, and some say so, therefore, it seems just the way it is. The problem is that the rules in Deuteronomy seem to be less generous than the rules in Leviticus. And so why would you be going backwards and putting more restrictions in place than existed before? Usually things evolve in a more expansive sort of way, rather than you have the right to X, you have the right to Y, you have the right to Z. Oh, no, we're going to take some of those back. Right? And if that does happen, you then have to sort of look at why is something changing, right? And it's tied to who are these resident aliens who are thriving in the land so much so that they can, in fact, have Jews who are indentured to them.
It sounds like a cowboy movie where you have the sheep herder and because they didn't like the sheep in the area because the cattle were in the other area because the sheep would eat too much of the grass, etc. So you used to have that struggle. Okay, today we have it with so many foreign countries buying the land. And so therefore you would have, and the other one would be your right to water. There's always been a big fight that who owns the river and who owns whatever happens to be the body of water. You know?
Yep, no, this is a huge problem. And just, by example, I mean, Israel has certain water sources, right? You've got the Jordan River, flows pretty much the entire length of the land all the way down to the Dead Sea, where it sort of, quite an expression, dead ends. All right. Further near the top, you've got the Sea of Galilee, which is filled with lots of water, right? But the headwaters of the Jordan are in Syria, because rivers don't know from national boundary lines, right? So that's now nothing's happened because Syria needs those waters to flow just as much as Israel needs those waters to flow. But if something were to happen, that could be a source of significant conflict.
It's like the deltas in the Mississippi.
Mhm.
You have this flow issue because everybody put their deltas up and therefore it influences the flow of the river.
Mhm.
And therefore that interferes with not just water for irrigation, but water in terms of transport.
And if I pollute the waters, well, if it's exiting my territory, what do I care if the schmutz is in your what previously had been your drinking water?
Good point.
Right. So I want to take you forward in time to the time of Nehemiah. Right? Just to set the historical context, Nehemiah lives during the early part of the Second Temple period. Right? The Jews exiled to Babylonia are given permission to return to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple by an edict of Cyrus, who is the king of the Persians, who become the empire that succeeds following the Babylonians. Nehemiah comes back to the land, appointed as governor by Cyrus, and discovers that the situation is in many ways bleak. So this is from chapter 5. There was a great outcry by the common folk and their wives against their brother Jews. Some said, "Our sons and daughters are numerous. We must eat grain. We must get grain to eat in order that we may live." Others said, "We must pawn our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain to sleep off hunger." Yet others said, "We have borrowed money against our fields and vineyards to pay the king's tax. Now we are as good as our brothers and our children as good as theirs. Yet here we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters already subjected, and we are powerless while our fields and vineyards belong to others." Okay, does this sound like the situation a little bit of what we got going in our parsha? It angered very much this is Nehemiah, to hear their outcry and these complaints. After pondering the matter carefully, I censured the nobles and the prefects, saying, "Are you pressing claims on loans made to your brothers?" Then I raised a large crowd against them and said to them, "We have done our best to buy back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. Will you now sell your brothers so that they must be sold back to us?" In other words, we spent a lot of money and resource buying them back from foreigners. Why? Because at the time of Nehemiah, I remind you, the Babylonians had played spin the nation. And they took people from here and moved them there, and people from there and moved them here. So who had filled the vacuum when the Jews were exiled, or many of them were exiled to Babylonia? The Babylonians brought some other groups who established themselves on the land, and now the Jews were sold to them. Right? And since the Torah here requires first and foremost that you liberate Jews and their lands that are held indenture by resident aliens, well, now we've used up all our money and now we're in debt, but now at least we're in debt to other Jews, but it's not any better because we're both starving and impoverished, and our land is held by others.
That hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Sadly, but it hasn't changed.
They kept silent, for they found nothing to answer. So I continued, what you are doing is not right. You ought to act in a God-fearing way. Does that sound like our Torah portion, like our book of Leviticus? So as to not give our enemies, the nations, room to reproach us. I, my brothers, and my servants also have claims of money and grain against them. Let us now abandon those claims. Give back at once their fields, their vineyards, their olive trees, and their homes, and abandon the claims for the 100 pieces of silver, the grain, the wine, and the oil that you have been pressing against them. They replied, we shall give them back and not demand anything of them. We shall do just as you say. Summoning the priests, I put them under oath to keep this promise. So may God shake free of his household and property any man who fails to keep this promise, and may he be thus shaken out and stripped. And all the assembled answered, Amen, and praised the Lord. And the people kept this promise. All right. In many ways, this is an acting out of everything we've been describing. So from the requirement that those alien residents be paid off so as to redeem both people and land from them, why do you have so many resident aliens? It's because it's emergent from this moment, this era in Jewish history, as opposed to a time when you had resident aliens, but there were few and far between, and they were not thriving like this. Okay. Talked enough about that. Okay. So let's get to our Torah portion and see what it is that is going on. But appreciate that we can't always read things sequentially, and we have to sort of sometimes stop and go back and say, how and why does this make sense? Context. And context sometimes requires us to look a little further. Okay. We're now ready for verse 25. If your kinsman is in straits and has to sell part of his holding, his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his kinsman has sold. If a man has no one to redeem for him, but prospers and acquires enough to redeem with, he shall compute the years since its sale, refund the difference to the man to whom he sold it, and return to his holding. If he lacks sufficient means to recover it, what he sold shall remain with the purchaser until the Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, it shall be released, and he shall return to his holding. Okay, what doesn't get mentioned here?
First of all, are we talking about land, or are we talking about personal property or personal items?
In this case, we're talking about land, right? But understand that because the person was so tied to the land, if a person sold their land, they often went with it because they had nothing and nowhere else to go. You know, it's not like Farmer Joe sells off his a farm or part of his farm, and his children go to work in the next county in some factory. Okay, what's notable here for our purposes is that the liberation, if it can't be done either by the individual or by someone in the individual's clan, it waits until the Jubilee year, the 50th year, which meant that this could be a long-term indenture.
Do you know the telephone has been ringing constantly for 10, 15 minutes?
I've heard it. I don't know why it's doing that.
Let me go check.
On one level, it should go to,
Oh, because there's somebody pushing it, there's somebody at the door.
Still?
The
Phone is still ringing.
oh, Elaine is at the door with somebody, but I know what happened. The person rang the bell. Elaine
It's our daughter,
answered the door,
it's our daughter.
okay, but nobody turned off the ringer. And I need to find my bag so as to plug in my computer before. it's
6
powered
days
on.
it shall ring, but on the 7th day it shall not.
Okay, that the phone just stopped ringing.
Let's move on. Picking up at verse 29. If a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, it may be redeemed until a year has elapsed since its sale. The redemption period shall be a year. If it is not redeemed before a full year has elapsed, the house in the walled city shall pass to the purchaser beyond reclaim throughout the ages. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. But houses in villages that have no encircling walls shall be classed as open country. They may be redeemed, and they shall be released through the Jubilee. Okay,
Why the difference?
okay, you tell me why the difference.
Don't know.
The
Okay.
walled city has a means to make your living with trades and
Okay.
skilled workers, whereas there's no land really to start a crop or.
Okay, so walled cities, of which there are not many, are not or no longer considered part of arable land. Because you can't grow stuff, you know. Yes, there are, I mean, now we're seeing, community gardens popping up in certain urban communities, but by and large, urban centers were not places where you grew anything. And so they were treated differently than villages where you were in the middle of what was arable land and could be returned to arable land. And arable land is an achuzah, is a holding that cannot be voided. Therefore, it is, even if you sell a structure that's on arable land, it is not a permanent transfer, whereas non-arable land, i.e. walled cities, are in a separate other category because they've been removed from the arable land category. So if you sell a house in a walled city, you've got a year in which to buy it back. But you don't have the same permanent claim to it because your permanent achuzah holding claim only applies to arable land. Remember, this was a primarily agricultural society, and there were very, very few walled cities.
Jerusalem and Jericho.
Jerusalem, Jericho are basically it. So you're not carving out a whole lot. You know, and while I suppose we could have a discussion about how that fits in terms of modernity and modern cities, where basically we don't have walled cities, but many urban cities are built in such a way as to negate the possibility of them being considered arable land.
But it reminds me of something. I grew up in Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And Maryland has a law, and I don't know of any other states who do, though I'm sure there are, called quick rents. Quick rents. You could buy a house, but you didn't buy the land it sat on. And you had to own the house for 20 years while you paid rent on the land. And after, I think it was after 20 years, you could then buy the land.
It's a good deal for landowners.
Yeah, but separate people own the land and own the house. And as I say, I don't know of any other place that does that.
I remember when my parents bought their house, they bought the land separately. It was but they owned the land and the house.
But they had to buy it separately.
Right.
Huh.
It's interesting because when you were concerned about us moving here, it's because we don't own the land. The J owns the land.
Right.
Who did you pay for the land? Was it the state?
It was separate.
No, it was whoever owned it.
Separate.
Huh. Interesting. Mark?
I lived in Hawaii for 3 years, and they also had a similar rule about separate ownership of the land and the structure that might be on it. So there's at least one other example of a similar way of dealing with property.
Interesting. Huh, I've never heard of that before. I'd be curious whether it was more widespread than Maryland and Hawaii.
I would assume so, but I don't know.
Oh, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating question. Okay, so that's the distinction that the Bible draws. And now it's going to turn to another category of which also has its uniquenesses. Verse 32. As for the cities of the Levites, the houses and the cities they hold, the Levites shall forever have the right of redemption. Such property as may be redeemed from the Levites, houses sold in a city they hold, shall be released through the Jubilee. For the houses and the cities of the Levites are their holding among the Israelites. But the unenclosed land around their cities cannot be sold, for that is their holding for all time. Okay, so just a quick background reference. When the land is being divvied up amongst the tribes, there's a lottery and an allocation of territory based on tribal size and geography. Right? So bigger tribes got bigger pieces, smaller tribes got smaller pieces, and where they were was somewhat randomly assigned, at least theoretically. You know,
Is this land won in battle?
well, in the book of Joshua, yes. Remember, when the Israelites arrive on the at the land of Israel, it's not empty. And we know that they defeat
Six
Og.
or seven.
They
ites.
they defeat Og, the king of Bashan, and Sichon, the king of the Amorites, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, as they're getting closer to the land. And the tribes of Reuven and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh say, you know what, we will forego our share on the western side of the Jordan. Just give us this side because this is really good pasture land and we have large herds and flocks. So they forego their share on the western side of the Jordan and stay there. The rest of the land is then divided up, but it first needs to be conquered. Right? And the book of Joshua describes the conquest of the land against the Amorites and the Ammonites and a bunch of other ites. And the book of Judges shows that the process was not quite as complete as the book of Joshua may have intimated, and that the struggle to maintain the land and its contiguity and integrity continues through the book of Judges and into the book of Samuel, and perhaps even into the book of Kings. Right? It's only during the reigns of David and Solomon that you have a maximization of the territory of the Israelites and a reprieve from conflict with other nation states and groups.
Thank
you. Okay. Where are we here? Okay, so the other thing is that so in the division of this land, the Levites, who are not given a specific or singular tribal territory, are given 42 cities around the country as Levitical territory. The closest modern equivalent that I can think of is the Vatican, right? The Vatican is smack in the middle of Rome, but it's not Italian territory. Right? So the Levitical city, you could have, you know, this Levitical city could be parked right in the middle of the tribe of Judah, but it was not the territory of Judah. It was an independent Levitical city. Houses in that Levitical city could be sold, but they could not be sold in perpetuity because that was Levitical tribal territory, and it was an achuzah, it was a holding. And the area around those cities, there was a designated area around each city, which was meant for the Levites to engage with in agriculture in order to provide for themselves. That while the houses could, for a period of time, be sold, the land around it was inviolable. So that if Levite X decides, you know what, not farming this year, the land just sat, but it was part of the collective holding of the Levites of that city.
Five.
Okay, I think that's it for that. I'm looking now at verse 35. You can feel free to look wherever you like, but I'm looking at verse 35. If your kinsman, being in straits, comes under your authority, and you hold him as though a resident alien, let him live by your side. Do not exact from him advance or accrued interest, but fear your God. Let him live by your side as your kinsman. Do not lend him money at advance interest or give him your food at accrued interest. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God.
I want to ask you a question here.
Okay,
Almost every funeral that I go to, including yours, includes the eulogy.
I was gonna say,
I know, I got scared there.
No,
your phraseology.
I said that wrong.
Yeah,
I
let's
said
fix
that
that a
wrong.
little bit, please.
No, I meant that when a eulogy is done.
Yes.
At the cemetery, Rabbi Dror did the same thing, and it was the thing about interest, that you don't have unfair interest. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, why is that such a big deal? Is that because it's back then it's a big deal, or is today it's a big deal?
Well,
It always comes at a funeral, and we're like, why? Why is it here? Did you
well,
mention
it's in, okay, so it's in funerals because it's in the book, it's in the psalm, and the rest of the
Yeah.
psalm really kind of speaks to certain things.
It's all that data stuff, you know?
Yeah, so it's sort of idyllic qualities.
Okay.
All right, and the psalmist is in many ways reflecting the ideas that are presented here, that you are supposed to provide
Five.
support and succor to others in your tribal or national grouping. That you shouldn't take advantage of their difficult situation or moment.
The reason I asked the question is because to me, that's not appropriate. I don't give interest to anybody. I mean, in my lifetime, because of my position, there's nothing I was saying would charge you interest from doing the following. So therefore, why is this going to be included for everybody? Because I saw it's in Psalms, I know it's David said it, but still.
That as to why it's so ubiquitously mentioned, it's because when you're quoting, you don't always
You don't-
edit the
You
quote.
don't say, okay.
All right, the other thing is, and I think part of why we're more sensitized to it goes to Jewish history. Through the entire arc of Jewish history in the Christian world.
We were the money lenders.
We were allowed to be the money lenders because the Christians also sort of picked up on this idea. So, Mr. Christian business owner couldn't charge Mr. Christian farmer interest because it's a no-no. Again, just an example of selective
And Jesus-
reading.
And Jesus kicked the money lenders out of the synagogue.
Yeah, well, yeah, except he didn't, but that's
But
okay.
that's a different subject. But I mean, I appreciate the thing here is because the interest piece seems to be a big one all along the line. That's why I.
Yeah,
Even if you go back to the agriculture, and I remember the book by Goodman, which was called The Progressive Bear. One of the things about the Great Revolt was the interest rates which were charged by banks.
Hmm.
And how much they objected to that.
Because ultimately, it was a way of perpetuating poverty.
Yes, it does. It's like the state loaners, which we had here. I don't know if you had up there in New York or Albany. But these were people that would get money before their payday. And the interest rates, that were like 135% by the time you finish.
Yeah, no, it was a horribly abusive system. And so the idea here is you're not allowed to engage in that because built into the Israelite system are resets.
Okay. So you get out of poverty, in other words.
Right. Now, part of what's being described here, and the rabbis have to grapple with this as well, because by the time the rabbis are grappling with societal issues, you have a change in which the Israelites are moving from an agrarian base to a more artisan based
Okay.
community. Right? So you have you're still going to have lots of people who are in farming and herding and all those professions, but you're also starting to develop more and more people who are craftsmen, who are living in urban centers where the agricultural piece of it doesn't work, and the way business works is a little different than the way farming works. So if we talked about the farming cycle of I need to get money up front in order to be able to produce my crop, which is my income source and my food source, and I repay my debts, and then I rinse and repeat the whole cycle on an annualized basis. If I'm an artisan, if I'm a craftsman, I don't have that same kind of cyclicalness. So therefore, I have to come up with different models for enabling.
Yes, you do. If you're an artisan, you have to have a way of getting your raw material that you're going to use to create something, and you have to sell it so you have a ability to buy the next, or
Yeah, the difference is that I can buy this much silver at the beginning of the month, make some jewelry and sell it and have money at the end of the month. As opposed to the farmer whose outlay is in the spring and whose revenue doesn't show until.
but I might not sell my silver for a month or two.
You might not. No, I recognize that there's a certain vagary to it, but theoretically, I don't need to have a 12-month supply of materials on hand in order to start my business.
Sure.
And so that's kind of plus, if I am borrowing startup money, quote unquote, when do I pay you back? Do I pay you back in 12 months? You know, I don't need to use the farmer model of payback, because I can't ask the farmer to pay me back on a monthly basis between the time he borrows and the time
Right,
he has money at the end of the season.
but you can ask
But
the
I can-
artisan.
The artisan can, all right? And so what the rabbis describe as a way of getting a little bit around this very strict imposition against charging interest or taking a bite. You know, so I can't lend you $100 and take 10 back and only give you 90. I can't take that bite back. So I can, however, you are now my partner in this business.
Sure.
And as my partner, you get X every month.
It's called royalty on Shark Tank.
Well, I don't know. I've never watched Shark Tank, so I can't say, but
No, it's not, if you buy, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna give you interest in, I'm gonna charge you $100,000. I want 10% of your company. In addition, I want $1 royalty for every hat you sell.
okay. That seems a little usurious, but okay.
But that's, I mean, that's.
But ultimately, I as the person who I'm coming to you for this money, have to be able to determine whether in fact
It's worth it.
that's a good deal for me, as well as, you know, obviously it's a relatively good deal for you because you're just putting your money that you probably have excess of on the barrelhead. The question is whether I can give you 10% off the top and $1 on every hat and still make a profit and a living.
That's the kicker.
That's the kicker.
Was this bartering system also when we switched from agriculture to artisan? In other words, if you give me 3 hats, I'll give you X amount of wheat.
Oh, I'm sure there was a fair measure of that. That coin was not always the means of transferring ownership. Because, let's take our farmer again, all right? What does the farmer have most?
Land.
Well, I was gonna say crops.
Right.
Because he doesn't want to give you land,
No, he
all
doesn't.
right? But okay, Arnie, you like to have bread on your table?
Yes.
Okay, well, here you go. I will give you a bushel of grain, and you will give me
One of Elaine's beautiful glass works of art.
no, 2 of them, because I can't eat her works of art, but you can eat my grain. But yes, whatever the commodity that I need coming back or want coming back, that could be a commodity.
But the difficulty is, I was thinking of monopoly. When you are in a strong position and the other person's in a weak position, your negotiations take advantage of the weak person. So it's sort of like you landed in New York, I want my $1,000 for the hotel. And since you don't have it, I'll tell you what, I'll take your 4 railroads in this place. And you sit there to say, well, no, I don't like that deal. You sit there and say, they'll give you $1,000.
Right, which is why this is here to try to mitigate taking over advantage of someone.
Okay,
Okay, Mark.
interesting.
To take Annie's example a step further, in terms of the royalty deals, sometimes the lender will say, I want the royalty in perpetuity.
That's another one.
Sometimes they will be more generous and say, I want the royalty until I get my initial investment back,
Mhm.
or I want the royalty until I get X times my initial investment back. So there are many variations of that royalty kind of deal. I also like to watch Shark Tank, and Mr. Wonderful is the guy who is usually the Scrooge,
Should watch
putting the screws to people.
just a couple times to get a
But you
sense of it.
see, you were right in that the fat cat can lose $100,000. But
Right.
you couldn't afford to lose $100,000
No.
because it would
No.
absolutely wipe you out.
If I had it, I wouldn't need to borrow it.
I think the whole point
right.
of this is trying to teach us, do not take advantage of others. And don't cause people to go into bankruptcy
And
and justice. There you
Yes,
go.
justice,
yes, but I understand and appreciate that it's very much within the group focus. Right?
Yes,
It's not-
Jews,
Yeah,
Jews. treat Jews
It's like, how do you treat members of your clan, members of your tribe, members of your nation? Okay, there's less, I don't want to say there's no concern in the Torah for the treatment of outsiders, because there is, but at the risk of sounding like a commercial, membership has its benefits.
And I was gonna say, so I can go to my credit card company. And if there is a Jew who's part of the leadership, I can say, you're taking advantage of me and you're not allowed to do this.
And after he gets up from the floor because he's been laughing so hard, the first thing that he does is security.
But I also think of the other way, and I was thinking of a little bit personal, in that my grandfather died, and he gave the business to his son, and his son did absolutely nothing for the 2 daughters. And it was always said that basically that was not my grandfather's intent. But my uncle immediately incorporated the company in his own name, and he always said it can't be done. If he incorporated it when my grandfather was living, then the two daughters would also have been involved.
Mhm.
And how many times do you see that within the family? I can't believe you did that to your own family. I
Mhm.
can't believe you did that to your own brother, sister.
Mhm.
So I thought the discussion was very worthwhile.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You are
Yes,
welcome
me
as
too.
always, everybody.